Hello and welcome to this webinar, which is all about managing your children's anxiety. My name is Dr. Caroline Gibbs and I'm a clinical psychologist for the Children's Wellbeing Service in South West London. Today's workshop is an introduction to what anxiety looks like in children, and we're going to run through some techniques to think about how to support your child with their anxious thoughts, feelings and behaviours. So just to give you a bit more detail about what we'll cover today, we're going to be looking at two broad themes. So firstly, how anxiety might present in children and how this can impact the way they think, feel and behave. And we'll then look at how we can support children with any worries or anxiety they might be having, thinking about some techniques you can try out, and also thinking about how to avoid the common traps that anxiety often leads us to, and that's reassurance and avoidance. So we all know that worries are really normal and that all children will experience worries or anxiety at some point in their lives, just in the same way that adults do. Sometimes it won't affect their day-to-day lives too much, but at other points they might need a bit more help from the adults around them. So this table here is really just to demonstrate how children's worries and fears change throughout their development. And this really links to their understanding of the world and as their brains are changing and developing. And as this is happening, children and young people will learn new things to worry about and adapt to. And it's really important to consider the environment and the context in which a child is living in, because we know that what's going on in their lives really has a significant impact on what they might be worrying or thinking about. So obviously at the moment, the pandemic is likely to be having an impact, and we know that it's affected children to varying degrees. So some have really struggled as a result of this, whereas others have found it not too difficult to cope. So how can we work out whether a child's anxiety is normal and when it's become problematic? So here we're looking out for a few key things. So firstly, the length of time. Has it been going on for a long time and just not shifting or perhaps getting worse? How manageable does it feel for the child or the family? Is it causing a lot of distress for everyone involved? We think about how it's having an impact on that child. Is it getting in the way of them in their day-to-day activities? And are they starting to rely on more reassurance from those around them in order to cope? Now, whether or not your child is experiencing what we would term normal worry versus something more problematic, all the skills we're going to talk through today will be helpful in helping them to manage. So we're first going to take a look at how our body responds to anxious situations. I'm sure many of you will have heard of the fight, flight or freeze response. This response is our body's survival mechanism that developed when we were cavemen to protect ourselves from danger. We're now going to show a short video to remind you of the key elements of how we react when we feel under threat.
Humans, like all species, have self-protective mechanisms to help us survive. Our fight, flight or freeze survival response, the FFF for short, is designed to mobilize our brain and body to fight an enemy, run from an avalanche or freeze to hide from a predator. Our brain sometimes misinterprets safe situations as dangerous and can set off false alarms. When the amygdala, our brain's watchdog, senses and barks danger, our body enters survival mode quicker than our rational mind can react, leaving it trying to figure out why we feel in mortal danger. When the FFF alarm is sounded, we start to breathe more quickly and shallow, causing hyperventilation, and our heart starts beating very fast. These changes can cause strong chest pain, which many people interpret as symptoms of a heart attack, when in fact it's just a result of the FFF activation, which can be relieved through breathing exercises. As a way of getting you ready for action, blood is diverted towards the major muscle groups. Blood flows away from our digestive system, causing the bladder to relax, and we might feel the need to pee. The mouth goes dry, nausea can occur, and we get the butterflies feeling in our stomach. Blood also rushes from extremities, leaving us with cold hands, but often sweaty palms as the action-ready body starts sweating to avoid overheating. Legs and hands can start trembling and feel weak, while tension starts building in big muscles like the thighs, neck and shoulders. In our head, FFF alarms cause our brain to focus on negative memories, probably so it can scan them to avoid danger and negative outcomes. We get tunnel vision as our pupils dilate to increase our focus and long vision, but as a result, we lose our peripheral vision. FFF activation also reduces our ability to recognize differences in facial expressions. Too much oxygen and too little CO2 can result in dizziness or lightheadedness, which many people interpret as signs that they might faint. But because fainting is caused by a drastic drop in blood pressure, and because the FFF increases both our heart rate and blood pressure, it's nearly impossible to faint when this happens. Over time, depression, anxiety, and high levels of stress all harm the brain's ability to slow or cancel false FFF activations, causing them to happen more often. Knowing the symptoms of false activations makes it easier to recognize and reduce their effects.
So in our sessions with parents and young people, we tend to use body maps to help them to recognise when they're starting to feel anxious. So the example on the left is one we might use with parents, and the one on the right is when we might be doing it with a younger child. And this is something that you could do at home with your child to help them to start to recognise what sort of things they notice and whereabouts in their body do things start to crop up when they feel anxious or worried. And something that younger children often complain about when they're feeling worried is a tummy ache. So helping them to make this connection is really helpful for their emotional development. And you can find these body maps really easy on Google. If you just Google blank body map, you'll be able to find lots of choice there. So we know that anxiety is often made up of 3 components. So we've got the anxious bodily sensations and feelings that we've just seen in the fight, flight, freeze response. And alongside this, we also have anxious thoughts. And this is where we tend to overestimate danger and underestimate our ability to cope. And it's the combination of these bodily sensations and the anxious thoughts that then lead to what we might call anxious behaviour. And this is where we might start to avoid situations or seek reassurance from others. And what we'll come on to thinking more about is how these behaviours only serve to keep anxiety going. So the anxious thinking that we've talked about, that's that overestimation of danger and the underestimation of ability to cope. We just thought we'd share some examples as to what children might think about when they're worried. So they might hear a noise and think someone's going to into the house. When they see a dog, they might think the dog's going to bite me. They might be fearful of being sick in front of other people, or that something bad will happen to a loved one. And that underestimating their ability to cope, they might feel, I don't know what to do, I'm going to need support with this, and I'm never going to get this right. So they're really lacking in their confidence of their own abilities. And then we've got this anxious behaviour. So we've talked a bit about the reassurance and avoidance, but there are other ways that children might demonstrate that they're feeling anxious. So lots of questions, they might cling to others, they might say difficult or hurtful statements, they might hit out or cry, or have what we might call a tantrum. And we know that avoidance is that really common behaviour that's used to get rid of the feelings quickly. And you might recognise this because it's often what adults tend to do as well. And that's because it's just such an effective thing to do in the short term. But we'll think more about this in the moment. And it's perhaps important to say that where children don't have the language to describe what's happening, that's when you might find that they engage in the more demonstrative behaviours like tantrums or crying or hitting out. And we often find that reassurance seeking is something that's quite common in younger children too. And again, this is what makes children feel safe. But again, it's only helpful in the short term, because the more you give it, you might find the more your child requires it to cope. So let's now look at this in a bit more detail and think about how each of these anxious experiences link together. So first, we'll look at a positive cycle for a very common experience. Your child is starting a new class. Their response to this might be to have excited thoughts. I can't wait to meet my new teacher and make some new friends. This then leads them to feeling very excited, and they might experience butterflies or start to feel a bit restless. As a result of this, they might start to become very chatty, a bit fidgety, and it might take them a bit longer to go to sleep. And you can see that these factors also interact with one another. So feeling butterflies might also then add to the excitement, which then leads to further positive thoughts. So now let's look at a child who might have some worries about starting a new class. So we use exactly the same cycle, but this time their thoughts might be worrying about not making any friends, that the work will be too hard, or that their teacher won't be nice. And this might then lead them to feeling worried, sad, or even angry that they're having to start again. They might then start to feel a bit sick and nauseous or have a headache. And so in an attempt to cope, they might try to avoid going to school, perhaps saying they feel unwell, or they might ask for lots of reassurance from their parent or caregiver. And again, here we can see how these characteristics all interact with one another. So the physical sensations further convince that child that there really is something to be fearful of. If their body's feeling this way, then there must be something to be worried about. And this then exacerbates the emotions and fuels those worry thoughts. And with the avoidance, what we know is that this provides that short-term relief, but that it only serves to keep the anxiety going, because that child never learns that actually it wasn't as bad as they thought, that they could cope, or that even if it was a very challenging situation, that they were able to manage. And again, with reassurance, that short-term solution, because it only provides that temporary relief from the anxiety. So you might have noticed with your own child that when they're in the habit, they keep coming back for repeated reassurance. So what can we do to help? There are a number of things that we can do to support children work through these worries and face their feared situations. So we want to help them address these worry thoughts. This is a really key step, as often the thoughts maintain the anxiety. So here we use a technique called thought balancing. We can also use problem solving, where there are possible solutions to a problem, but it's really important to say you wouldn't use problem solving where a child has absolutely no control over a situation, for example, where a grandparent is very unwell. So we can also support and target a child's anxious behaviour, where we encourage them to be brave and to face their fears in what we call a step-by-step plan. And if this is done gradually, with the child's agreement, it can really help to reduce those physical symptoms and start to build their confidence. And we can also learn to support our child to learn coping strategies to manage some of the uncomfortable physical sensations that they might experience. So we'll go through some of these things now. So before we can start to use the strategies, we need to really get a good understanding of what it is that the child is worried about. So often children might notice how they're feeling, but really struggle to explain why this is happening or what it is that they're thinking about. And some children, particularly younger children, aren't able to verbalise what they're scared of or why. So they might feel very anxious about going to school, but they can't say what about school is making them feel anxious. Now, you might notice that often our first response to our children or even to ourselves or friends is to say, oh, don't worry, you'll be fine. But again, this falls into that reassurance camp and you might find it's not as helpful as you think. So instead, we want to use questioning in a really empathic and validating way to allow the child to express themselves, to help them to know that how they're feeling is okay, and really helping them to name the emotions. This is also validating because the child feels they're being listened to, they're being understood. And if it's obvious or they've expressed how they're feeling, you can really reflect this back to your child and ask more about it. So something like, oh, I can hear you're worried about staying at Jessie's house. What do you think will happen? If you have a sense of what's happening, but the child might be struggling to identify, you can have a guess and help them to label. So you might see something like, oh yes, well, if I was starting a new topic, I think I'd be scared about getting it wrong. Is that something you're worried about? So you're normalising how they're feeling and again, validating. And you really want to focus on the emotions as much as you can rather than the behaviours that you might be seeing. So if a child lashes out or is having a tantrum, you can still validate how they're feeling without letting them know that a certain behaviour is not acceptable. So you might say something like, I can see you're really worried about me going away with work, and it's okay to feel this way. Let's just sit down together and take a few deep breaths, and when you feel calm, we'll think about what might help. So thought balancing is that first skill that we talked about, to think about how you can support your child with the worries that they might be having. And it's something that you can teach your child to do to help them to evaluate their worries without seeking that reassurance. So this technique can support your child to reflect on their immediate worry thoughts and balance this out with other ideas. Now, at first, it might seem like you're going to have to do this a lot, but we want this to become a habit so that when they come across a difficult situation for themselves, they can start to develop this practice of thinking about balancing those thoughts. So let's look at a common example that parents often talk about, where their child might be asked to attend an overnight school trip. So they might come to you with their worst case scenario, that they're going to get really scared and upset, that they won't be able to sleep all night, and they'll be worried because you're not going to be there to make them feel better. You might then ask them to think about, okay, so that's the worst case scenario. What's your best case scenario? So that might be something like, I'm going to have loads of fun, I'm going to get pizza, I'll really. You might get them to think about, okay, so that's the worst and the best. Let's try and think about something in the middle. So we call this a balanced thought, and we can help the child to get to this point by asking questions, just as we did on the previous slide. So thinking about, has this happened before? What makes you think this will happen? Have you seen this happen to someone else? If your friend was worried about this, what would you say to them? And these sorts of questions really get them to think about, okay, how likely is it this will happen? What might be a more likely thing to happen? It might be, I might miss you, but I know that Miss James will be there to look after us, and I've had lots of fun at sleepovers before. Okay, so coming on to reassurance, as we've said, this is something that anxious children often ask for from the people around them, and it's really natural that parents would want to reassure their child to make them feel better. See, it often seems like the right thing to do, and it's often very instinctive. And as parents, you know, we often find ourselves saying, you'll be fine, there's nothing to worry about. But as we've said, this can really work to maintain the anxiety in a number of ways, because it often offers that short-term relief, but then leads to greater dependence on more reassurance. So it's yet another vicious cycle. And also giving your child this reassurance sends them the message that there might be actual danger that they need to be protected from. So a common example we hear about is of a young girl who might ask every night for reassurance from their mum that no one can get in and that they're safe. And mum might give all this reassurance saying all the doors are locked, no one can get in, we live in a gated community, there's nothing to worry about. And that child feels reassured in the short term, i.e. for that night, but then starts to become reliant on this reassurance to feel safe every night going forward. And the other thing here to mention is that it really stops our child to learn how to manage these worries on their own. So what can we do instead? So it's similar to the previous example of where we need to start asking questions rather than giving solutions. So we want to try and encourage children to think up and weigh up the situation for themselves. So it might be, what are you worrying about? What else might happen? What could you do to help yourself feel braver? It's also really important to show the child that you believe that they can do it. So validate the emotion. I know it feels scary, but I think you can do it. Shall we have a go? And it's also really important to try to remain calm, because we know that children can pick up on our anxieties. So it's really important to be mindful of your own emotions. And even if there are times where you feel nervous for them, really do your best to try to show them that you've got the confidence that they can do it. Okay, and the other common trap that we often fall into with anxiety is avoidance. So we know that when children feel full of something, they naturally want to avoid it. And we know that parents sometimes allow or encourage children to avoid because they want to protect them from feeling scared. But we know that it really helps to maintain the anxiety, because the child doesn't learn that they would have been fine. They won't learn that they can cope with the challenges. And the sad thing is that they really might miss out on things now or in the future that they might really enjoy. So an example might be, if a child never goes to sleepovers, they'll never learn how to kind of manage feeling homesick. And then if they have the opportunity to go away for a longer period of time, like on a school residential trip, they won't have learned how to be away from home, and it will feel much too difficult for them to go. So instead of letting them avoid, what we want to do is really take a bit of a step back and let the child have a go. So here we're really encouraging their independence. So we want to notice and praise any brave behaviour that we see, even if it feels very small or something that, you know, might feel quite easy for the child, really to comment and highlight when they've been brave. It's also really important to model brave behaviour. So if there are things that you might feel afraid of, that you feel you could push yourself a little bit just to show that you can do it, things like being scared of spiders or insects, you know, how can you show your child that even though you're scared, you're going to move the spider out of the window or something? And what we want to do is really encourage children to start to face their fears in small, manageable steps. So we want to kind of think about how they can start to just push themselves a little bit at a time at a pace that feels comfortable for them. So if they're scared of, I don't know, ordering something in a restaurant, you might start by getting them to do a takeaway over the phone, or perhaps just order a drink in a cafe first. Okay. And to help us build up brave behaviour in children, we use something that we call a step-by-step plan, and this helps children to build up their tolerance to that feeling of anxiety and helps them to start developing coping strategies by encouraging them to face their fears. And the really key thing here is to do it in small, manageable steps. So step one, you think about the situation that your child is finding a bit worrying. You then think about all the steps that might need to happen from least anxiety provoking to the most, and then you invite the child to take that first step on the ladder, and it might be that you need to repeat that step quite a few times until they feel comfortable to go to the next one. And something you could inquire with your child after they've completed the step is to think with them, what have you learned from carrying out that step? How does it feel now that you've carried out the step? Was it easier or more difficult than you expected? What do you think might happen if you were to do it a few more times? So again, really encouraging them to reflect on what they're noticing, what they're learning as they're putting themselves in these slightly scary situations. Okay, so here is an example. We're going to use a really common fear that children have, where they might have to ask a teacher a question in front of the class. So here we've got 5 steps. We're starting with the easiest at step 1. So they might ask the teacher a question after class is finished. Then step 2, they might answer a question asked by the teacher, which you've planned and set up in advance with the teacher, so it's something that they know. Then the next step might be to answer a question asked by the teacher, which you haven't planned, but something that they can do in a much smaller group. You might then invite the child to ask a teacher the question in the small group, and then finally building up to that final step of answering a question by the teacher, not planned in advance, in front of the whole class. And as I said before, they might need to kind of repeat a few steps a few times before they move up to the next one. And it's really about the child feeling empowered to know when they're ready to move on to the next. So we also sometimes use praise and reward. So this really helps your child to motivate them. So we really encourage praise as a primary kind of technique here. And any rewards you might want to offer are things like low or no cost rewards. So it might be choosing a favourite pudding, choosing a treat, maybe going for a trip or going to the park, or just spending a bit of quality time with one of their parents. So this is something you could come up together, and as I said, really try not to kind of go for huge things here and really focusing on the praise. This is how we want children to sort of learn to feel good about themselves for doing these things. It's not just about getting reward at the end. And if a child gets stuck on one of their steps, you might need to look at that step in a bit more detail and perhaps break it down even further into smaller chunks and repeating those steps before moving up again. So it's absolutely natural to kind of come up against bumps in the road. You might find that one of the steps just feels that little bit too ambitious. So really just normalise that for the child. That's okay. Let's break it down and take it a bit slower. Okay, so there are some other techniques that can help to support children. Sadly, we don't have time to go through all of these today, although we do have some shorter videos on our website that go through some of these techniques. So just to say that if your child experiences lots of bodily sensations, then they might find controlled breathing or progressive muscle relaxation helpful. And there are lots and lots of videos on YouTube to explain how to do these, and lots that are age appropriate for younger children. Similarly, child is having lots of different worries and lots of what if thoughts, we sometimes use something called worry time, where you allot an amount of time each day for the child to worry. And if they start to worry or approach you with worries at other points throughout the day, you just gently remind them that we'll think about this later when you have your worry time, and then direct them towards a different activity. And for slightly older children who are experiencing worries that might be more realistic, so this isn't for things like what if thoughts or things that are out of their control, rather things that there might be solutions for, you can use problem solving. And again, there are lots of examples as to how the steps you take. There's a very structured format to problem solving, and it's something that children can learn to do with the support of an adult. And finally, we really recommend the following book. This goes through all of the strategies we've spoken about and more. It's very accessible and easy to read, and it has lots of useful real life examples to draw upon. So it's Helping Your Child with Fears and Worries by Kathy Creswell. If you do feel that your child would benefit from more help, we really encourage you to speak to your school, your local children's wellbeing service, or visit your GP so that you can access further support. And it's really important to remember that things won't just change overnight, but the more you try out these techniques, the bigger impact they'll have. And finally, a really key message that shouldn't be underestimated, just a reminder that we know parenting can be really difficult, and parenting an anxious child can be even harder. So it's important to take care of yourself and seek support from your loved ones, colleagues, or your local health service if you need to. Our children are very sensitive to how we act, so it's really helpful to monitor our own emotions when we're supporting them with their worries. And it's also important to recognise that our own experiences might be influencing how we parent. So, for example, if you once fell off a bike and hurt yourself, you might then be nervous about your child learning to ride a bike. So just being aware of these past experiences and how they might be having an impact. Try not to let them to lead you from preventing your children having coping experiences. And a huge part of helping children with anxiety is being able to manage your own emotions and really trying not to react in too emotional way to your child's distress. And although this sort of slightly overrides your natural instinct to protect via encouraging them to have a go, putting themselves in feared situations, we know this is really difficult to do if you're already feeling overwhelmed and struggling. Parents have a lot going on with work or caring for other family members. And although we can't stop these things happening in our lives, it's important just to be aware of the impact they might be having and accessing support if you need to. So again, whether it's informal support with friends or loved ones or something via your GP, we really encourage you to seek support if you feel that you're struggling. Parents often feel it's selfish to put their own needs first, but it's absolutely impossible to be the parent you want to if you're feeling totally overwhelmed and stressed. So please do seek support if you feel that you're struggling. So thank you for joining. We hope you found the webinar helpful today, and please take a look at our website. We've got lots of other videos on there that you might find useful. Thank you.